When most people think of Iran, they imagine carpets, bazaars, poetry, domes, and ancient palaces. But that is only the surface, because beneath that surface lies another Iran, darker, older, and far more disturbing. A place where, just a few decades ago, the dead were left on stone towers for birds to strip clean. A place where, 7,000 years ago, someone was cutting into living human skulls deep inside a cave. A place where entire villages are avoided after sunset because the air itself may be playing tricks on the human mind. And strangest of all, a place where the ground is collapsing right now, swallowing parts of the country in a slow-motion disaster that almost nobody outside the region talks about. Iran is not just an ancient civilization, it is a layered historical landscape where the past does not stay buried. It rises through ruined villages. It hides inside caves. It waits beneath modern streets. And sometimes it opens directly under people's feet. Tonight, we are going through 7 of the darkest and most unsettling mysteries hidden in Iran, from ritual death and underground cities to plague pits, ghost valleys, and a catastrophe unfolding in the present. Because in Iran, the most frightening things are often not the ones in legends. They are the ones history left behind. In the city of Yazd, standing against the dry landscape, are structures that seem almost unreal in the modern world. They are called the Towers of Silence. At first glance, they look like abandoned circular ruins on the hills, but their purpose was anything but ordinary. For followers of Zoroastrianism, death created a problem that was not only emotional, but spiritual. A corpse was considered impure. It could not be buried in the earth without contaminating the soil. It could not be burned without contaminating fire. And it could not simply be thrown away. So another solution was created. The dead were taken to these towers and laid out in the open, exposed to the sun and to scavenging birds, especially vultures, until the flesh was stripped away and only bones remained. Later, those bones would be gathered and placed into a central ossuary pit. This was not some obscure ritual from a forgotten prehistory. That is what makes it so disturbing. This practice survived into the modern era, not thousands of years ago in some unreachable past, but within living memory. There are still people who remember the atmosphere around these places, the silence, the birds, the smell, and that is what gives the story its weight, because it collapses the distance between past and present. It forces you to understand that ancient ritual was not always safely confined to museum glass and textbook pages. Sometimes it survived right up to the edge of the modern world. The Towers of Silence are frightening, not because they belong to fantasy. They are frightening because they were real. Because for generations, people climbed those hills carrying their dead, knowing exactly what would happen next. And once you accept that Iran still held places like this in recent memory, the next mystery becomes even stranger. Because now we move from ritual death to a village people avoid after sunset. Some places become feared because of what happened there. Others become feared because of what people believe still happens there. In Iran, there are abandoned settlements and remote zones surrounded by stories so persistent that locals simply avoid them at night. One such story centers on a so-called cursed village, a place tied to whispers of strange visions, unnatural fear, and the sense that something in the landscape itself turns hostile after dark. According to local legend, the place was touched by a wandering dervish, cursed, marked, or somehow left spiritually wrong. People say that after sunset, the air changes. Sounds distort. Shapes seem to move. The mind no longer feels steady. This is the kind of story that spreads easily in harsh landscapes. But what makes it interesting is that alongside the legend, there is also a rational possibility. Some researchers and observers have suggested that sulfurous gases or other emissions linked to geological fractures in the region could help explain the strange sensations people report: dizziness, disorientation, fear, or even mild hallucination under the right conditions. And that is exactly what makes the story effective, because it sits on the border between myth and chemistry. Maybe there is no curse. Maybe there is no haunting. Maybe the village is not spiritually poisoned at all. Maybe the land itself is leaking something invisible into the air. But in practical terms, that does not necessarily make it less terrifying. In some ways, it makes it worse, because a ghost can be dismissed. A landscape that quietly alters human perception cannot. This is one of the recurring patterns in Iran's darker mysteries. Folklore often forms first, and only later does science arrive with a partial explanation. But the rational explanation rarely destroys the fear completely. It just changes its shape. The cursed village remains powerful because it reminds us that not every terrifying place is terrifying for supernatural reasons. Sometimes, the earth itself is enough. And if a place can manipulate what people feel, then imagine what happens when we find evidence that ancient people were doing things to the human body that still feel impossible to understand. Because the next site is a cave, and inside it were skulls. In 2006, researchers working in Iran uncovered something that sounds less like archaeology and more like the opening scene of a nightmare. A cave, ancient drawings, and human skulls bearing signs of trepanation, the deliberate cutting or drilling into the skull. The remains were estimated to be around 7,000 years old. That fact alone is enough to stop you. Because trepanation is not just an injury, it is intervention. It means someone in deep antiquity took a living human being and opened part of the skull intentionally. Why? That is where the mystery begins. In different ancient cultures, trepanation has been linked to ritual, medicine, spiritual belief, head trauma, pressure relief, or attempts to treat pain and neurological problems. But knowing that such practices existed in principle does not remove the shock of seeing evidence of them in a real human skull. Especially when another detail appears. Some patients seem to have survived the procedure, which means this was not random mutilation. It was not simply violence after death. It was a controlled act carried out on living people with enough skill or enough luck that at least some of them continued to live afterward. And that creates an unsettling image: a dim cave, a wounded or chosen person, stone tools or primitive instruments, hands pressing into bone, no modern anesthesia, no sterile operating room, no full understanding of infection the way we know it today, and still, somehow, survival. That forces a difficult question onto the viewer. What did these people think they were doing? Were they trying to heal? To release spirits? To treat seizures, madness, pain, visions? Was it medicine, ritual, punishment, transformation? No final answer closes the mystery. And that is what keeps it dark. Because whenever ancient evidence shows technical skill without clear meaning, the imagination rushes in to fill the gap. We see the wound. We see the survival. But we do not know the purpose. The Cave of Skulls is horrifying because it proves that human beings were reaching into the head itself thousands of years ago. Not metaphorically, literally. And if that makes ancient Iran feel unsettling, the next case brings the horror even closer to the present. Because this time, the dead were not hidden in a cave. They were buried beneath a city. Modern life depends on forgetting what lies underneath. Roads are paved, pipes are laid, buildings rise, neighborhoods expand, and over time, people stop asking what the ground once held. But in parts of Iran, particularly in old historic cities such as Hamadan, the past does not always stay quiet. Because beneath places where people now live, walk and build, there may be layers of mass burial linked to earlier epidemics, especially from centuries when disease traveled along routes tied to commerce, migration, and the Silk Road. This is where the horror shifts. It is no longer about ancient ritual. It is about proximity. Imagine workers digging for sewage lines or water systems. Imagine routine construction. And then imagine bones appearing from the soil. Not one skeleton carefully buried, not an isolated grave, but signs of older burial zones tied to plague, panic, and emergency death. That is the unsettling core of the story. A modern city functioning above the memory of epidemic collapse, people buying groceries, children walking to school, apartments rising, concrete being poured, and below it all, layers of hurried dead. This kind of mystery works because it destroys the comforting illusion that history is somewhere else. We like to think the worst events of the past happened far away, in protected ruins, in distant deserts, behind museum labels. But plague burial does not respect that boundary. It sits beneath the ordinary. And once people know that the ground below them may contain mass graves from centuries-old catastrophe, every familiar street becomes slightly different, more fragile, more haunted, more temporary. What makes the story especially powerful is that it is not driven by myth. No Jinn are needed, no curse, no supernatural force, only disease, fear, burial, and forgetfulness. Sometimes that is enough. And if a modern city can exist on top of the dead without fully seeing them, then the next mystery is even more frightening. Because in the next case, the hidden world below did not stay hidden. It opened, by accident. Some discoveries begin with a major expedition. Others begin with an accident so simple, it feels almost absurd. In Nushabad, the story goes that a man digging a well broke through into something impossible, a hidden underground world beneath the city. What emerged was not a chamber, not a cellar, not a collapsed tunnel, but a multi-level underground city, passages, rooms, escape routes, a defensive labyrinth beneath the settlement, built so that entire communities could disappear below ground during times of danger. On its own, that is already fascinating. But the emotional force of Nushabad comes from one detail: a child's sandal. Among the objects found in the underground spaces, one small item carries far more power than any architectural plan ever could. Because a sandal is not abstract, it is not strategic, it is not grand, it is human. A child was down there, and the moment the thought lands, the whole site changes. You stop seeing only tunnels and engineering. You begin to imagine what those passages were actually for. Families descending into darkness, people hiding in silence, waiting for footsteps above them, waiting for violence to pass, trying to keep children quiet, trying to stay alive underground while slaughter or invasion unfolded on the surface. That is the true horror of Nushabad. Not merely that it existed, but that it had to exist. Underground cities are often described in terms of clever design and defensive planning, and that is true. But behind every defensive structure lies the same story. People built this because they expected terror. Someone knew the world above could become unlivable. Someone knew that survival might depend on vanishing beneath the earth. And when one child's sandal survives in the dark after centuries, it tells the whole story without words. It says there were children here. It says they hid here. It says the danger was real enough to drive them underground. Nushabad is not frightening because it is mysterious. It is frightening because it is intimate. And after that, the next location feels almost supernatural again, because now we move to a valley where the temperature changes too fast, and strange knocking sounds echo in the dark. Iran has landscapes that seem designed to generate legends: deep cuts in the earth, wind-shaped ravines, silent stone corridors, places where sound behaves strangely and light disappears too quickly. Among the most unsettling is what many refer to as a valley of the Jinn, a gorge or ravine tied to stories of unexplained noises, nighttime dread, and sharp drops in temperature. Locals speak of knocking sounds, echoes that do not seem to come from visible sources, a feeling that the valley changes after dark. And perhaps most strangely, reports that nighttime temperatures can fall 8 to 10 degrees in ways that feel abrupt and unnatural. That last detail is important, because even where folklore dominates, physical anomalies give the legend traction. A place does not need to be haunted to feel haunted. It only needs to behave in a way the human body does not trust. A sudden cold pocket, unfamiliar acoustics, wind compressing through rock, echoes arriving from the wrong direction. Once those ingredients are present, myth arrives almost automatically. The language of jinn, spirits, or presences becomes a cultural way of describing an environment that feels hostile without obvious cause, and science does not always erase that feeling. Even when explanations are proposed, airflow, geological structure, sound reflection, thermal behavior, the place can remain emotionally untamed because the body reacts before the mind completes the analysis. You hear the knock, you feel the cold, you stop rationalizing, you leave. The Valley of the Jinn belongs to that category of mystery where the explanation may be partly physical, partly folkloric, and partly psychological, but the experience remains real either way. Fear does not become less real just because it has a mechanism. And by now, after death towers, cursed air, skull surgery, playground, and hidden underground cities, the video seems to have reached its full darkness. But it hasn't. Because the final mystery is not ancient, it is happening now. And it may be the most terrifying of all. The final mystery is different from everything that came before it. It is not a legend, not a ritual, not a ruined site, not a buried secret from antiquity. It is a modern catastrophe, and it is unfolding beneath Iran right now. In parts of the country, the land is sinking, in some areas at alarming rates, with reports of subsidence reaching up to tens of centimeters per year. Roads crack, infrastructure strains. Urban zones become vulnerable. The earth itself begins to lose stability. Why? Because of water. Or more precisely, because of the destruction of underground water reserves. Across Iran, the long-term overuse of groundwater, driven by agriculture, wells, drought pressure, and unsustainable extraction, has emptied aquifers faster than they can recover. Once those underground systems collapse or compact, the land above them begins to drop. And the scale is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of wells, exhausted groundwater systems, drying regions, cities and infrastructure exposed to slow structural failure from below. That is why this final section is so effective, because it turns the mood of the entire video inside out. Until now, we have been looking downward into history, but suddenly we realize the ground itself is no longer stable in the present. Iran is not only a place where terrible things once happened beneath the surface, it is a place where the surface is now losing its support. A silent catastrophe. No dramatic explosion. No single moment of collapse seen around the world. Just pressure building below year after year until streets, buildings, and landscapes begin to deform. And in some ways, that is more frightening than anything ancient. Because this is not a solved mystery from a dead civilization. This is a warning. A modern state standing on a deepening structural crisis tied to water, climate, extraction, and time. The ground is sinking. And the worst part is that it happens slowly enough for people to keep living above it, until one day the consequences are too large to ignore. So think about what we have just seen. A land where the dead were once laid out for birds on silent stone towers. A cursed village where the air may distort what the mind perceives. A cave filled with skulls showing surgery performed 7,000 years ago. A modern city standing above plague burials. An underground refuge where a child's sandal still remembers the terror above. A valley of cold echoes and invisible knocking. And now, a nation where the earth itself is beginning to collapse from below. These are not 7 random curiosities. Together, they create a different image of Iran. Not the postcard version, not the simplified geopolitical version, not the version reduced to headlines, but a deeper Iran, a layered Iran, a place where the boundary between ancient fear and modern reality is much thinner than it looks. And perhaps that is what makes these stories so powerful. The horror is not separate from everyday life. It sits just beneath it. Maybe that is the real secret of Iran. Not that it is haunted, not that it is cursed, not even that it is mysterious, but that it has learned how to live with depth, with history pressing upward from below, with memory buried under cities, with ruins, rituals, and disasters sharing the same landscape as ordinary life, because even knowing all this, people still make tea. They still lay carpets. They still read poetry. They still raise children, argue, laugh, build, mourn, and continue. And that may be the most astonishing thing of all. Iran is a country where some of the darkest things lie only a little deeper than most people are ready to dig. And still, life continues above them. Quietly, beautifully, stubbornly. So which of these 7 mysteries disturbed you the most? The Towers of Silence? The Cursed Village? The Cave of Skulls? The Plague Pits? The Underground City? The Valley of the Jinn? Or the silent catastrophe happening right now beneath Iran? Write your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, places where history, fear, archaeology, and reality collide in ways that feel almost impossible, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because sometimes the darkest parts of history are not hidden far away. They are hidden just below the surface.